Light and colors are vibrations received by the eye. Sound is vibration received by the ear or by a microphone. The recording process is very much like painting. The palette with which we have to work is the whole world of musical and non-musical sounds. Microphones are the brushes with which we gather these vibrations. This program explores ways to alter the hues of sound colors, add texture, depth, and contrast to the picture that we're painting for our mind's ear. Hi, I'm Tom Lubin. This is the second of two programs dealing with signal processing. The first program introduced the basic concepts and then focused on equalizers and variable gain amplifiers. This second program will focus on delay and reverb devices. But for the benefit of those who may not have seen the first program, and for those who would like to review, we're going to repeat the basic concepts of signal processing. If you wish to skip this section, fast forward right now to the title, Delay. You won't hurt my feelings. Really. Signal processing allows us to take basic sounds and shape and blend them to create depth and texture. Signal processing is sculpturing sound in space. In Madison Avenue terms, it's the secret sauce of music and sound mixing. In fact, if there's any single thing that makes a master recording different from a demo, it's the creative use of the right signal processing. There are four basic building blocks to signal processing. Each block represents many different types of devices, and each modifies the sound differently. The four basic blocks are equalizers, variable gain amplifiers, delays, and reverb devices. In most cases, a certain sound is created by connecting together two or more of the blocks in a certain way. By manipulating and altering the basic building blocks of sound sculpture, you're able to create the textural depths and subtleties which contribute to a master quality recording. Equalization and variable gain are inline devices which work best when all the signal passes through them. Or put another way, the only signal which is heard is the one that is passing through the processor. Delay and reverb should be added to the direct signal as sidechain effects. The output of the unaffected direct signal is blended with the output of the processor. Equalization is basically a tone control. By filtering or enhancing different frequency ranges, equalization can change the timbre of a sound. It can enhance or diminish any of the overtones that a sound might have, such as harmonics and subharmonics. It changes the hues of the colors. Variable gain amplifiers, or VGAs, modify the dynamic range of the loud to soft of a sound. VGAs include limiters, compressors, noise gates, and expanders. They can make a loud sound less loud, or they can make unwanted quiet sounds disappear. They can reduce the attack of a sound and accelerate its decay, or they can increase the attack of a sound and make it more percussive. VGAs alter the density of the sound and affect the contrast of the affected color. Delay devices store sound for a certain amount of time. Delay alters time and creates reflection. Delay can change time relationships, provide thickness, reinforce notes, or create phase cancellation. It can also expand or contract real time through time modulation. Reverb devices create space. They create the illusion of a room by replicating the way sound would bounce and reverberate in a real interior space. Reverb brings sound to life. It gives the impression of power, adds drama, size, and depth. In recent years, it's become possible to make master quality recording in Lilliputian home studios. Probably the most significant factor in this revolution has been the emergence in 1978 of digital signal processing, and then the proliferation of sophisticated low-cost signal processing devices. Really, they are computer-controlled magic black boxes that let each programming magician bring their own sound vision to life. All of these devices do their magic by shaping and manipulating audio signals. But before we start to explore those possibilities, let's review the nature of an audio signal and how it's created. Everything in nature is made up of vibrations, waves, periodicity, and all wave phenomenon follow basically the same rules. As waves move out from their point of origin, their energy is dissipated. When they strike something, they reflect and cause interference with subsequent waves. Sound is a pressure wave, an undulating sphere of changing atmospheric pressure, moving out in all directions from a vibrating source. If some point is described as a relaxed, neutral position, a wave will have a positive excursion or compression of the atmosphere and a negative excursion or rarefaction of the atmosphere. When the wave strikes a sensitive surface, like the diaphragm inside of a human ear or the diaphragm inside of a microphone, the fluctuations in atmospheric pressure create a corresponding vibration in the diaphragm. The microphone uses the vibration of the diaphragm to create a fluctuating electronic signal. Right now, you're looking at the signal produced by my voice. Once amplified, that signal can be used to vibrate the diaphragm of a speaker, which in turn creates the atmospheric pressure waves that we hear as sound. Reality sound is definitely not a simple wave, but for the sake of description, that's what we'll be using. This is a sine wave. We have a signal generator hooked up to an oscilloscope, and we can both see and hear the tone. The frequency of the signal is the number of complete cycles that occur in a given amount of time. This is usually described as cycles per second. As the cycles per second increase, so does the pitch. A wavelength is the physical space occupied by one complete cycle. On Earth, sound travels about 1,100 feet per second, with some variation depending on altitude and temperature. So, this 1,000 cycle tone has a wavelength of little over 1 foot in reality space. Here on the scope, that wavelength is compressed so that we can observe it. The amplitude of the wave is how loud it is. Basically, the higher the wave goes above or below the median, the louder the signal will be. In the case of acoustic power, it is the amount of sound pressure variation above or below the prevailing atmospheric pressure. In the case of an electronic signal, it is so many volts above or below the median voltage. Now, the average median voltage, or ground plane of an electronic circuit, is halfway between the positive peaks and the negative peaks. When the signal rises above the median, the speaker cone is pushed outward, and when it goes below the median, the speaker cone is pulled inward. Zero level is a point which the designers of a system, for instance a console or tape recorder, have chosen as the average maximum operating level of the system, though allowances have been made for occasional signals of greater magnitude. The strength of the signal is measured in decibels, a unit of sound measurement, above or below this average operating level. The dB unit is always measured in comparison to some reference level. For instance, 0 dB SPL, sound pressure level, is the threshold of hearing for the average person. A loud rock band will be between 100 and 125 dB SPL, and the studio that we're in is at about 10 dB SPL. Level meters are reference to a certain level of signal into a specific resistance. The most common average operating levels are minus 10 dB or plus 4 dB. In correctly designed contemporary equipment, a minus 10 system will provide equal quality to a plus 4 system. Headroom is the dynamic range between the average operating level of a system and the level at which severe distortion will take place. Clipping is what happens when the loudest peaks of the signal bump against the ceiling of the amplifier. The peaks are flattened or distorted. Remember that any change in the signal as it goes through the amplifier or through the signal processing devices could be considered distortion. Good distortion, that's when you like it. Bad distortion, oh, that's when you don't. Because one man's music, well, it's another man's noise. Now I'd like to introduce you to the 4 signal processing devices we'll use to create most of the effects and sounds you'll hear on this tape. Our equalizer is an Lubin Model 642 parametric equalizer. Our variable gain amplifier is a DBX 166 compressor limiter noise gate. Our delay is a vintage MXR. And our reverb is an ART DR1. Now, these are all outboard processors. Inboard processors are those built right into the board. A lot of boards have basic to very elaborate EQ built right into them. And the near future will probably bring us many more types of digital processing built right into the board. There's a lot of good equipment out there to choose from, but often a piece of equipment will have lots of knobs, light up like a Christmas tree, and have oodles of settings, none of which sound any good. It's how it sounds that matters, not how many whistles and bells it might have. Outboard effects, like the ones we'll be using, are usually plugged into a circuit for specific needs. Though it may be easier, it's not a very good idea to set up your system so that your effects are continually in the signal path. Connect them through a patch bay so that you can add them as you need them. That way, you have to make a conscious decision about which of them you want to use. It's also quieter that way. If you keep your effects continually hooked up the same way, you'll find yourself repeating the same patterns. Going through a gated reverb period, for example, or a heavy echo delay period, instead of choosing the best effect for each new sound. If you don't have them always hooked up, you'll connect them differently, depending on what you're trying to achieve. For instance, the reverb might come before the equalizer and the delay before the reverb for one session, but the order could be completely reversed for the next session. Which elements you use and how you hook them up will vary with what you hear in your head. Remember, as you hook these devices up, to follow the logic of the signal path. The output of one device is always hooked up to the input of another device. And the average operating levels of the devices you hook up, they should match. If they don't, if, for instance, you're trying to connect a +4 processor into a -10 board, you'll need to use a level matching amplifier between them. Now, real-time digital processors, such as this unit and this unit, use extremely fast, high-speed circuits that generate lots of heat. If high-tech signal processors are not well ventilated, they will tend to get noisy, they'll lose their programs, and if they get too hot, well, they'll simply blow up. So if you're using conventional racks, provide adequate ventilation space between each of the devices, and it's also a good idea to mount a small fan in the back. Oh, and by the way, they don't like smoke very much either. The film that smoke leaves behind changes the performance of the microprocessor circuitry. Although most outboard gear is rack mountable, there are lots of stomp boxes out there, guitar pedals, that could be considered outboard equipment. Most of them are a little bit too noisy to be used for recording, but the quality of this gear is improving, and some of it can be used as though it were rack-mounted outboard gear. If you do use a stomp box and don't want it to sound like you're driving a taxi cab, make sure it's running off a power supply or is using brand new batteries. Another trick you might try is to creatively use an outboard DBX noise reduction system. Encode the signal before it goes into the stomp box and decode the output. The question always comes up, do you process the signal before or after you record it? I think you want to create or capture the sound as close as you can to the way you want it to sound in the final sonic panorama. So add it as you record. Signal processing in past years was a little reverb and later some tape delay. As such, it was always added later, after the fact, usually in the mixdown. Part of the fear of adding signal processing during the actual recording process was based on the high cost of going back into the studio and having to re-record the part. Now, if you own your own gear, these kinds of fears become less of a problem because it's easy to go back and re-record something if you find that you've added a little too much of this or that. The advantage is that you're able to hear the sound in context, and much like it'll sound in the final mix. After all, when your mind's ear hears a certain snare sound, you don't hear the snare and then 3 weeks later hear the reverb. The reverb is integrated with the sound of the instrument. It's impossible to say where the instrument sound ends and the effect begins. So it's better to shape the sound and the effect together. Besides, if you wait until mixdown to add processing to some key track, you may find that the space for that effect has already been filled with an overdub. Now, the other thing is that if you have a minimum amount of signal processing gear, one of each of the 4 basic building blocks, for example, and you wait to add them until you mix down, what ends up happening is that your overall mix will have a sameness of texture and lack definition and clarity. If you add a certain amount of reverb and delay as you go, you're able to increase the overall complexity of your sound. You can make it sound as though you have more processing tools, and most importantly, cater each effect to the particular sound that you're recording. Now, these days, more and more people realize that signal processing is an integral part of today's sound, and therefore they add that secret sauce as they go. We've completed our introduction to the 4 basic building blocks of signal processing. All of them work by shaping or combining audio signals. Equalizers and variable gain amplifiers selectively shape the amplitude of a signal and should be placed directly in the signal path. Delay and reverb devices recombine a processed signal with its source and should be placed in the side chain of the signal path. You should set these devices up so that they can be used flexibly in varying sequences and combinations. They can be used during the recording process, again when combining tracks, and during the final mix to shape the overall sound. Delay devices have the ability to create the impression of acoustic reflections in a real space. Sound travels at approximately 1,100 feet per second. What you're hearing is the direct sound of the rifle combined with the reflection of that sound off the hillside 250 feet away. That sound has to travel 500 feet to get there and back. So we're hearing it about a half a second or 500 milliseconds after the direct sound. Now, why did I mention milliseconds? Because delay devices are calibrated in milliseconds, which doesn't mean a thing to most of us. But to use a delay, you need to be able to relate milliseconds to distance, or the amount of time that it takes sound to travel in reality space. Since sound travels at approximately 1,000 feet per second, and a millisecond is 1,000th of a second, a given impulse will travel a foot about every millisecond. So think of a millisecond as roughly 1 foot. That means if your delay is set at 50 milliseconds, you're approximating what happens when sound hits a wall about 25 feet away and comes back to you. That's a total of 50 feet. By thinking of delay settings in terms of reality space, it becomes much easier to visualize in your mind's ear a particular effect that you want to create. The human ear is not able to discern fairly short delays. This range of short delays is called the Haas zone. In this case, the bounce off the wall reaches our microphone only 5 or 6 milliseconds after the direct sound and has the effect of reinforcing the direct sound. As the sound source gets further from the wall, we can begin to hear the sound bouncing off the wall as a distinct delay. How short a delay can we hear? Well, it depends on each person's hearing and the nature of the sound. About 7 milliseconds is the shortest perceptible delay as heard by a person who's wide awake and attentive. And that's only when the initial sound is percussive with lots of attack and no sustain. The longest imperceptible delay would be around 35 milliseconds for a sound that changes very little with time, like a violin or organ sustain. Medium delays that are within the Haas zone tend to reinforce a direct signal. But if it's an extremely short delay, you run into the phenomenon of phase shift.
To understand phase shift, let's look at a 1,000-cycle tone which has a wavelength of about 1 foot. Now, let's add the same signal fed through a digital delay and gradually increase the delay time. At first, the signals add and reinforce one another. But as the delay approaches a little over ½ of a millisecond, which is 1/2 wavelength of delay at 1,000 cycles, the two waves will be 180 degrees out of phase and opposing one another. Now, they nearly cancel each other out. This is called phase cancellation or destructive interaction. The same amount of delay on a broadband program will create a notch of cancellation centered at 1,000 cycles. Varying amounts of cancellation will also occur at frequencies where the delay represents 1.5 wavelengths, 2.5 wavelengths, 3.5 wavelengths, and so on. This is called comb filtering, because a group of narrow notches form what appears to be a comb in the otherwise flat, full bandwidth response curve. The depth of the notches will be less and less as the frequency goes up, because the delayed signal is further away in time from the original, and therefore less similar to the original.
The comb filtering effect can be very detrimental to the recording quality and cause hollowing of the sound on vocals, for example. That which is canceled out could be the fundamental tone as well as the all-important harmonics or overtones. Now, as the delay increases, the delayed sound will move further and further away from the undelayed sound. A few wavelengths away, the delay moves through the Haas zone and begins to reinforce the undelayed sound. The waves will constructively combine rather than destructively cancel. The combined output will reinforce and thicken or seem to double the sound rather than hollow it. When the delay time is beyond the Haas zone, it will be heard as a distinct delay.
In pop music, it's common practice to double a part. In other words, play or sing the same part twice. But those who are very good at doubling their parts need to be careful of cancellation. They may find that if they have both of their vocal tracks at equal loudness, well, for instance, the two combined will sound less full than when one track slightly dominates the other. It should be noted here that electronically doubling the sound with a delay will not produce as rich a sound as playing and recording the same part twice. Delays can be used to create reflections or echoes by taking the output of the delay and feeding it back into its input. The regeneration or feedback that results gives you repeating reflections. If the delay time is fixed, each subsequent reflection will be of the same duration. The number of reflections is increased by turning up the feedback control. However, too much regeneration will result in squeal-type feedback, particularly if the delay is very short or it's a swept delay.
Delay devices can create the impression of acoustic reflections or echoes. Delay time is measured in milliseconds. Now, a millisecond is the time it takes an impulse to travel about 1 foot. Extremely short delays will combine with the original signal to cause cancellation or comb filtering. Longer delays within the Haas zone will reinforce the original signal, but when the delay time goes beyond the Haas zone, the output will be heard as a distinct delay. Feeding the output of the delay back into its input will create regeneration or repeating reflections. Echo. When a truck passes you at high speed, the engine's whine goes up in pitch as it approaches and then goes down in pitch as it recedes. even though it may actually be revving at the same speed the entire time. The engine isn't changing its sound, but its sound waves are being compressed as the source moves toward us and stretched as the sound moves away.
This is called the Doppler effect. The same thing happens if you're standing in a field listening to a train go by. The train's horn goes up in pitch as it comes toward you, and then goes down as it goes away.
Another example is a Leslie speaker cabinet. Rotating horns positioned over the speakers focus the sound and cause it to come toward the listener and then go away as the horns rotate. Recall destructive interaction as earlier described. If the delay time is continuously changing or sweeping within a range, the frequencies of reinforcement will also be continuously changing. Swept or time-modulated short delays produce such effects as phasing and flanging. Longer swept delays will result in pitch shift caused by wave stretching and compression, producing such effects as chorusing and the Doppler effect. To understand how time modulation works, imagine 3 tape recorders playing the same material at the same time. They are all in sync. If we move one of the playback heads so that it picks up the signal a fraction of a second later than the others, it will produce a fixed delay. If we slide the third playback head back and forth between these 2 positions, it will produce a swept delay effect. All the time modulation effects involve combining a fixed delay with a swept delay. The fixed delay setting will also be the maximum delay time boundary for the swept delay.
For maximum effect with any of the time-modulated processes, it's important that the loudness of the swept delay be equal to that of the undelayed signal. The width control, sometimes called depth, varies the balance of the delay's output between a continuously sweeping delay and the fixed delay. Now, you're hearing right now on my voice 98 milliseconds of fixed delay. Listen as I gradually increase the depth. I'm cross-fading between the fixed delay and the swept delay. If you wanted a strong time-modulated effect, you would set the width control to full modulation. The speed or rate control regulates how fast the time is swept from a short delay to a long delay. It controls how quickly a delay change will occur. If it's slow, you'll get more gradual comb filtering or less apparent pitch shift. If you have it very fast, it'll sound very fluttery. A very fast speed with a very low depth will create a loud, constant delay with a much quieter, random, fluttered pitch variation, a setting I frequently used on delay into the reverb. Or you might want a slow modulation, which is set very deep for the effect of phasing, flanging, chorusing, the Doppler effect. In this case, as the delay time slowly moves, the comb filtering or pitch modulation will gradually slide from one pitch to the next. The pitch goes up as the delay sweeps from long to short, and it goes down as the delay sweeps from short to long. Both flanging and phasing can be used to create dramatic and exciting effects. They are similar, but provide distinct differences in sound. Both are created with a maximum swept delay time to around 20 to 35 milliseconds.
Flanging always has the swept delay after the undelayed signal. Since flanging has the delay always occurring behind the undelayed signal, cancellation only happens to one side of the undelayed wave. Phasing will sweep the delayed signal in front as well as behind the undelayed signal, so it leads as well as lags.
True phasing is impossible to do with an electronic device because you can't get the delayed signal to lead the undelayed signal. So the only way to really get the dramatic effect of phasing is to use tape recorders.
But if you don't have access to this many tape recorders, you can get almost the same effect by using two delays, with one set to a very short fixed delay and the other set with a slightly longer swept delay.
If the swept delay range is very, very long, the pitch will shift. The wavelengths of the signal entering the delay will expand or contract as the delay time increases or decreases during the period that the delay holds the sound. By increasing the delay time or expanding the wave, the pitch goes down. When the wavelength gets shorter, the pitch goes up. This is called chorusing, when the maximum swept delay time is between 30 and 60 milliseconds and becomes more of a Doppler effect as the maximum time becomes greater. In other words, chorusing is when the output signal varies pitch slightly above and below the input signal. With the Doppler effect, the pitch shift is more radical. The chorus effect is often used to simulate the slight frequency variation which occurs with multi-voice parts, such as a string section.
All of the time modulation delay effects use a combination of fixed delay and swept delay. This involves three variables: the fixed delay time setting, which also provides the maximum delay time boundary for the swept delay; the depth control, which varies the balance of fixed delay to swept delay; and the sweep rate, which controls the rate at which the device sweeps back and forth between a short delay and the maximum delay time. Flanging always has the swept delay after the undelayed signal. Phasing sweeps the delayed signal in front of as well as behind the undelayed signal. And very long swept delay ranges will shift the pitch of the delayed signal above and below that of the undelayed signal to create the effect of chorusing.
Before the days of electronic delay, considerable ingenuity was exerted to acoustically achieve delay. Various techniques were developed for putting sound through long pipes or coiled tubes, then re-amplifying them at the far end. The advent of tape recorders made it easier to achieve delay effects. Tape delay has been around for quite some time. Often referred to as slap echo, it works off a very simple idea. By recording on an ordinary 3-head tape recorder, while monitoring the playback head, you'll get a delay between the input signal and the output. Since the playback head is physically positioned behind the record head by about an inch, it takes a certain amount of time for the tape to travel that distance. The tape recorder is connected to an effect send, and the delay signal is returned back through the board just as though it were any other effect. While the distance between the heads on a tape recorder are fixed, the delay time can be altered by varying the capstan speed of the tape recorder. This changes the time it takes the sound to travel from the record head to the play head. Variable pitch controls are found on most of the machines made today.
Tape delay with feedback is attained by bringing the slap tape output back into an input channel and at the same time feeding some of that delayed signal back to the input of the delay recorder.
In order to keep the number of regenerations constant, be sure that the feedback send control does not change when the amount of slap echo is raised in the stereo mix.
On most boards, this can be done by selecting pre-fader on the slap tape effect send on the input channel to which the slap tape output is connected. Turning up or down this effect send controls the amount of tape echo regeneration.
Also, make sure that you're working within the dynamic range of the tape and not overloading it or under-recording to slap feed. Both things are very easy to do if you're not paying attention to the levels of the echo recorder.
Another thing to remember, you've got to rewind the slap tape, not just flip it over and start recording when it gets to the end. If the heads don't exactly line up, you won't completely erase what was recorded in the opposite direction. You'll hear small amounts of previous echo program played backwards. And probably there'll be some minister in a small town that'll think you're writing something satanic and burn all your records. Electronic delays sample the incoming signal so many times per second. Analog delays, which store a sampled voltage using capacitors, are used less and less these days. All the great recent advances have been in digital delays, which store musical information by transforming it into digital or ones and zeros type information. Once this has been accomplished, the digitized information can be further transformed in all sorts of wonderful ways. For example, with a digital pitch modifier, the sampled input can be mathematically processed to modify its pitch and then mixed with the input signal. A downward pitch shift with regeneration on a percussive sound will sound like this. The latest pitch shifters have several preset intervals, so that as the chord progression changes, the pitch shifter can manually be stepped or automatically sequenced to the correct musical interval. Now, all delays have differences. They all have different features. A certain setting on one unit will sound entirely different on another. Some sound very metallic, others sound very warm. You just have to decide what sounds best for what you're trying to do. Stephen Grier wrote, "I expect to pass through this world but once, for I shall not pass this way again. But delays change the laws of physics and the philosopher's view on the passage of time. They can take a certain amount of time and hold it, shrink it, and expand it. Then let it pass, the same point, time and time again. So some things can pass this way more than once. In fact, on some delays, you can hold and repeat forever.
We've seen that delay can be achieved acoustically. With tape recorders by taking advantage of the distance between the record and playback heads, or with an electronic delay device. With a digital delay, the delayed signal can be mathematically reprocessed, for example, with a pitch shifter. Reverb provides space, a common acoustic surrounding for all the various sound sources. It creates the illusion of a reflective interior environment. Reverb is ambience. All rooms have boundaries, and these boundaries create the ambience of the room. It is there even when nothing else is there to make it apparent. When sound is made in that room, a reverberation occurs. Now imagine, let's say you're sitting in the third row of a large auditorium, listening to a snare drum being played in the middle of the stage. First, you'll hear the direct sound. Then, you'll hear the early reflections bouncing off the floor, the ceiling, the back of the stage, and then a certain number of echoes will bounce between the reasonably parallel surfaces of the stage opening. These early reflections, occurring around 30 milliseconds or less after the original sound, will fall within the Haas zone and will tend to reinforce the sound. Extremely short early reflections, about 7 milliseconds, may cause comb filtering or phase cancellation. Finally, from the auditorium, the reverb begins as the sound bounces off the nearest walls and ceilings and then the far walls, the balconies, and so on. You will then hear the many reflections from the walls further away until the definition of the reflection becomes imperceptible.
Reverb is not echo. Even some of the board manufacturers treat reverb and echo as synonymous, and they're definitely not the same thing. Echo is a series of decaying repeats, each the same distance apart. And as we've seen, it can be created by delay with regeneration. Reverb, on the other hand, is the reflection of sound inside of a confined space. Reverb is an organic phenomenon, unlike EQ, loudness modifiers, and to a lesser degree delay. Reverb widely exists in nature, and the best way to learn how to sculpt with it is to be aware of it, to recognize it in reality space environments, and remember what it sounds like. Begin with the most common. Go to a parking garage and clap your hands, and then listen to what happens as the reverb bounces around. Or if your instrument is portable, take it with you and play it in that particular space. Hear what happens as the sound travels through the whole cavern of the garage.
Learn to listen for those individual elements and separations that exist in reverb. Where the early reflections are coming from. What frequencies linger longer. Learn to recognize where the boundaries of the space are and what they're made of from the qualities of the reverb the space is creating. You can hear the surroundings of a reality space even if you don't agitate it by clapping or making a sharp sound. In a large room like a cathedral, you can close your eyes and listen to that room in silence and hear the space all about you. The way to learn what a reverb should sound like in a recording is by having some touch with reverb in reality space.
To create reverb sounds like those you hear on record, you have to be able to pick out the individual reverb textures that have been simultaneously overlapped. Your mind's ear has to be able to hear the various elements that make up that total reverberant environment.
Imagine a picture frame and see the sounds as colors. You can have very stark, defined colors, or you can make it seem like a painting with soft, focused edges. All painters choose from the same colors, but the difference has to do with how they texture the depth and contrast in the picture. Reverb provides that depth and spatial sense. Reverb sharpens or it softens the edges of a sound. It provides the element of space.
In relating this concept to recording, you've got to be able to listen past what's in front, to be able to hear what's behind. If these different spaces weren't present, you'd feel something was missing. It wouldn't seem real or natural, and it would lack depth, power, and excitement. What's behind the voice? What happens after the drum? Again, try to relate what you hear on tape, yours or anyone else's, to the endless variety of organic reality spaces that surround you.
When you're recording, you're usually laying down 1 or 2 tracks at a time. But when you mix, you want all those tracks to sound as though they were actually being performed together in a 3-dimensional room. In order to make one single track sound as if it has depth and environment, you need to create a stereophonic reverberant field, something which surrounds the sound by being blended and panned to the left and right of it. Reverb can be called the glue of multi-mono because it holds it all together. It provides the illusion that all these isolated tracks were recorded stereophonically and at the same time in a common space.
Or you can use multiple reverbs to texture the sound. For instance, the snare might initially have an explosive gated reverb that would fall away into a different, softer, gradually decaying reverb. So you have 2 different reverbs that are heard one over the other.
In the same mix, the vocals might have a long, decaying, bright reverb that has some pre-delay.
Now you're making the scene.
The strings might have a reverb with constant density and a long sustain. These very different textures overlap to give the total illusion of the sound.
I turned the page and saw your picture in the hit magazine. Looks like your songs are gaining airplay. Now you're making the scene. I bet the girls all across the nation are taking you home. I bet you're an open that sensation wherever you go. My friends say you're way out of touch. You're out of my reach, but I want you so much.
Digital reverbs use mathematical algorithms to compute what would occur if you had a sound in a certain reflective space. They approximate the boundaries of the space and the acoustic characteristics of that space. For instance, there are programs which approximate a living room, or a large empty hall, or a large auditorium, or a cafe.
Some digital reverbs have nothing but a lot of presets. These are very usable as far as they go. But having adjustable parameters enable you to use the presets as starting points upon which to build unique environments. The most elaborate digital reverbs have infinite possibilities. Their presets are merely jumping off points into endless space. In order to get the best out of a digital reverb, you really need to have a concept of time and position, or place, in a given environment. In a sense, their various controls move the walls and change the angles and surfaces of the room that the computer's brain is creating. These controls can also change the position and character of the sound source, the listener, and the points where the reverb is being picked up in the computer's imaginary room.
With a digital reverb, you're building a box that you hear in your head. You're putting sound in the space you want to hear coming out of the speakers. To really stretch the possibilities of these magic black boxes, just twisting the knobs won't cut it. You've got to understand the concept of what the controls are doing and how they interact and interrelate, how they are changing the position and composition of all the walls of the space they're trying to simulate. You've also got to have in your mind's ear a certain idea of what the space needs to be to create the sound you have in your head. Just as digital devices can be used to recreate reality spaces, they can also be used to create unnatural reverbs that could never occur in reality space. Some examples of unnatural reverb are inverse reverb, where the reverb is louder at the end of the decay rather than at the beginning. Or gated reverb, where the reverb is very explosive, but then quickly dies away. Or pitch modulation, or chorusing within the reverb. Another popular one could be described as exceedingly big reverb, big hall type reverb, with no pre-delays. There is the sound of the snare, and then the reverb begins immediately. Now in reality space, that doesn't happen. All of these are unnatural reverbs which texturally create an impression of a certain mood or depth. We use them because we like the uniqueness of them. But these kinds of reverbs don't really exist in organic space. let's look at how to use these digital magic boxes to control the various aspects of reverb and work step by step to build the space that you hear in your head. Remember that in organic reverb, there's always a period of delay before true reverb begins. The pre-delay knob on a digital reverb controls the amount of time that passes between the direct sound and the first distant reflection. We begin with an unnatural zero delay, similar to the effect we demonstrated earlier.
Listen to the difference as we gradually increase the pre-delay.
Most engineers will add a certain amount of pre-delay to all reverbs so that they sound natural. Most reverbs, except for the digital ones, have no pre-delay built into them, so you must put a delay in front of the reverb to create it. Tons of spare tape recorders are still used for reverb pre-delay, and they vary the pre-delay time with the variable pitch control. During the pre-delay period, organic and realistic reverb will also have some early reflections to approximate the bounce off the walls and floor that are near the performer. Listen to the difference as I add early reflections to this long pre-delay. Diffusion has to do with the density of the echoes, or reflections, that occur in organic space. The diffusion can be very great if all the reflective walls are non-parallel, or it can be very well defined if all the walls are parallel. If the density of the reverb reflections are such that you can no longer hear discrete reflective flutters, it is described as diffuse, or as having high diffusion. If the reflections are very well defined as the reverb decays away, the reverb is described as having low diffusion. Most digital reverbs have variable diffusion, but because they use mathematical algorithms, this diffusion cannot be infinite because of the limitations of the reverb's inboard computer. On the other hand, spring or plate reverbs can have extremely high density and diffusion because of their infinite reflections. Definition can increase at the very end of the decay if the density and variation of the reflections are less. As the diffusion falls away, the definition becomes clearer. In other words, you will be able to hear the final individual reflections much more cleanly and defined in the very last of the decay. Depth describes where you are in a space when you hear a sound. In other words, where are you sitting in the hall? Now, most digital reverbs have either a specific depth control or depth variations in each of the programs. If you're listening to a vocalist sing, do you want to be in the front row or at the back of the hall? Because you are so cool. Do you want the lead vocals to be at a distance with a more engulfing ambience? Or do you want to hear them in your face with well-defined, close, early reflections, followed by some lower-level, longer decaying reverb?
We've seen that reverb is an organic phenomenon, the reflection of sound in an interior space. In multi-track recording, each instrument can be given its own reverberant environment. Digital reverbs can be used to craft complex spatial environments, or to create effects that could never occur in reality space. The reflection of sound in an interior space begins with early reflections, followed by a pre-delay period before true reverb begins. On many digital reverbs, these are adjustable variables. Digital reverbs may also allow us to control the density of the reverb with a diffusion control, and to position the listener with a depth control.
it comes to using reverb, you have to begin with the room itself. Before multitrack, the popular acts of the time always recorded in large rooms so that their instruments could reverberate and open up. And everyone would play and the singer would sing, and what was recorded was what went out the door. As multitrack emerged, everyone became much more preoccupied with leakage. So they built a whole generation of incredibly dead studios that had as little reverberation as possible. Carpet everywhere, tons of bass traps and absorbers, with isolation rooms for everything and everybody. They'd add reverb during mixdown in an attempt to make the recording sound natural, but with acoustic instruments and voice, this approach often missed the mark. The reason was obvious. The instrument itself, such as a guitar or violin, obtained much of its natural sound by sympathetic vibration caused by the reverberation of the room. If you put a microphone on a guitar, the microphone not only picks up a certain amount of direct signal, but the reverberation of the room that it's being played in. When there are no reflections, the vibrating guitar will sound lifeless and one-dimensional. Now, on the other hand, if that guitar is played and recorded in a room that is reverberant, the total sound of the guitar in the reverberant space is what the mic picks up. It sounds more natural. That's why today most studios, even small home studios, are fairly live, because we've seen the errors of our ways and, thank God, moved away from really dead sounds, dead studios, and dead, lifeless recordings.
To set the reverb sound, I always start with the snare because the snare is one of the few sounds in the track that happens continuously and has a space between each beat, so I can hear the effect of the reverb. On the snare channel, I'll turn up the auxiliary sends that are connected to the different reverbs. Even though I may not be planning to use that reverb sound on the snare, I'll still use the snare as the source. What I'm doing is using a snare to create the space where each instrument will be playing. Each auxiliary send is turned up while adjusting that reverb, and then turned down before moving on to the next. Each of the reverb returns, once evenly balanced, might be muted, but the level shouldn't be moved once they're set. Most of the time, you'll want to have a fairly bright reverb with a short or no low-frequency decay. Usually, if you use broadband reverb, the low end will seem to cloud the mix. The mix will sound muddy and seem to come from the bottom of a well. By cutting the low end out of the signal going to the reverb, you can raise the reverb's return and it will sound loud and apparent, but the total mix will still retain transparency. I often connect a graphic equalizer to the input of the reverb. In a sense, I'm tuning the room that the reverb represents. If you only have one equalizer, you should connect it before the reverb, because once the signal is bouncing around inside the reverb, it's more uncontrollable, and its effect on the total reverb sound can't be removed. Put another way, you want to control the creation of reverb, not fix the results. Rolling off the low end and brightening up the input signal to the reverb prevents low frequencies from agitating the reverberant environment. Only high and mid-range frequencies are allowed to expand in the reverberant space. This sort of reverb is organically unnatural, but it is pleasing to our ears and is a key to clarity in multi-track recording. Now let's try the same thing with an acoustic guitar. Now let's hear how snare, bass, and guitar all sound together. In organic space, the high frequency will decay much quicker than the low frequency. With a reverb device, we can roll off the low frequency and allow the high frequency to linger much longer, or manipulate the reverb time of the various frequency ranges. There are two different ways of controlling the decay of a reverb. One of the ways is to accelerate the decay of the overall reverb by putting a gate after the reverb. Then you have an explosive reverb that dies very quickly as a result of the gate closing. The other way is to have a frequency-dependent adjustment for the reverb's decay time.
Many digital reverbs have controls for low-frequency decay, high-frequency decay, and the crossover between these 2 points. Usually these controls actually aren't an equalizer because they don't change the frequency response. What they do is change the reverb time of the various frequency ranges. The low frequency is still present, but its decay is quick compared to mid and high frequency components in the reverb sound. The sound going into the reverb stays the same, but the decay time of different frequency bands is changed.
There's also a difference between stop reverb decay and running reverb decay. Some reverbs can be adjusted so that when a signal is present at the input, a certain running reverb time will be happening. But at moments when there is no signal going into it, the stop reverb time will take over. This stop reverb time can be adjusted independently of the running reverb time. There are no fixed rules for using reverb, but there are some principles that hold up most of the time. For example, the use of contrast between the foreground and background to provide relief and dramatic separation. If you use a lot of reverb on the voice, you should keep the instrumental tracks fairly dry. And conversely, if you use a lot of reverb on the instrumental track, make the voice fairly dry. Also, the sparser the track, the more reverb you can use. The more production in the track, the less reverb you can use and still have a dramatic effect. Use reverb textures by comparison to build excitement. Small sections with no reverb can have terrific impact. If the song is slow, you can use a longer decay time. For faster songs, you usually need a shorter decay time.
Remember to sit close to the speakers when judging your reverb and other signal processing effects, or the acoustics of the listening room will affect your decisions. Ideally, you should mix on speakers which are both phase coherent and a single point source. They should be designed for listening at a close range of about 3 feet. This creates a near-field environment, a sweet spot, which will cause you to lose the room around you and only hear what's actually part of the soundscape. Another thing I always do is hit play and then stop, and then listen to how long the reverb lingers.
Make sure that each individual and all the combined reverbs have sustains which linger evenly to the left and to the right,
or the mix will have a tendency to lean. I listen to each reverb separately, and I listen to them interactively. Sometimes reverbs working independently sound fine, but just like EQ, they may adversely interact with each other, resulting in a total sound environment that's not exactly what you want. Turn off one reverb at a time to find out which one is the offender. You might find you need to EQ or slightly readjust one of the reverbs to make the total sound work.
In setting up the reverb, use a snare or other transient sounding instrument to tune the reverberant space for the instruments you will be recording. By using an equalizer to tune the input to the reverb, you can remove low-end rumble from the reverberant environment and add transparency to the reverb in the mix. You can also use a frequency-dependent decay adjustment to accelerate the decay of the lower frequencies, and on some reverbs you can set running reverb and stop reverb independently. Contrast between very reverberant tracks and relatively dry tracks will add texture to a mix. When judging the overall effect, it's important to listen on a system that doesn't fool your ears and to pay attention to the stereo balance of all your reverb effects.
Now you've been introduced to the 4 basic building blocks: EQ, variable gain amplifiers, delay, and reverb. How these devices are used varies in as many ways as an artist can choose to paint a picture. There are no rules. It's a matter of what you want to do. The key to working with outboard gear is having a mind's ear vision of what you want to hear, a concept of what you want the sound to be before you ever start turning a knob. And when you do get your hands on one of these magic black boxes, take the time to just turn it on and play. The idea is to learn what something can do by itself and in conjunction with other processors. Different sounds with different envelopes, different frequencies, altering delays, finding the reverb at the bottom of a well. Many times, late at night, I've worn headphones and used a drum machine or just made noises, although I called it singing, into a mic plugged into a reverb, a delay, or other gizmo or gadget that I was trying out, amusing myself for hours until the daylight invaded that private space inside my head.